talk about leaving versus left, okay? And I want to talk about it kind of in the context of negotiating, like in the very beginning, when you're in those beginning stages, maybe you're still living together, you're trying to figure out how to pull this apart, what this is going to look like. And whether you're the leaving partner or the left partner has a huge impact on the emotional aspect of this negotiation. Before I dive into this, let me just remind you, as always, if you find the content helpful, don't forget to hit like on the video. Also, subscribe to the channel so that you get notified as new videos are released. And as always, feel free to share on social media. Help me reach more people who are struggling with these kinds of issues. We talk about this a lot, I think, in the marital context, but whether you're married or not, if you never lived together, never co-parented, it was like a one-night thing and you separated and that was the end of it, this may not play as much of a dynamic for you, although I think many times it does in a certain way. But obviously, if you were married or you were living together or in some sort of relationship that then broke down where you broke up, then this is a very relevant fact, okay? And I'm going to talk about it kind of in the context of marriage, just because I think that's a little bit easier concept to follow. But this applies whether you are married or not, okay? When one of the parties, one of the co-parents, right, decides to opt out of the relationship, what has typically happened, especially like in a long-term relationship, is that person has been thinking about that for a long time. They're like, they're unhappy, things aren't going well, there's all of these ups and downs in the relationship, and they're just struggling with themselves and trying to figure out what to do, okay? And then normally what will happen is you will hit a tipping point where that person goes, okay, I can't deal with this anymore. I'm done. I'm out, right? And then they announce to the other person, okay, look, I'm done. I'm out. We're not moving forward anymore. Then they're trying to go, okay, let's go to mediation. Let's try to work this, let's try to resolve our issues ourselves. Let's try to negotiate. Let's try to, whatever context that looks like. I think a lot of people are trying to avoid lawyers in the first instance, or at least hope to potentially, right? It doesn't always go that way depending on, the other person, even if that is what you want. But I think we have to understand the emotional dynamic of this. And I will tell you the number one mistake that everybody makes, okay, so that you can hopefully avoid that and be able to get your case into some sort of settlement mode if you have to go through this. But what happens is, okay, you've been going along, right? And you decide, okay, I can't do this anymore. I need out, right? And your emotions, like if this is a grid, right? Your emotions are at the upper part of the grid, right? And then when you make that decision and say, okay, I'm out, I can't do this. What happens actually is your emotional stress comes down, right? You plummet at that point because you're like, okay, I made a decision. I made an announcement. This is what I'm going to do. I at least feel better that I've made some kind of decision and things are better. The problem is at that point, at the very point where you make that decision and you announce it and your emotions come down, the other person's emotions, what happens to them? They ramp up. So they're literally on the opposite spectrum from you at that point. And this is why they're losing their mind. They're going nuts. They're dramatic. They're crying. They're begging you not to leave. They're, all of these things. And you're thinking, what is up with this? We've been struggling for years. We've been struggling for months. We've been, how is this a shock to you? And that's why, because you've emotionally processed and decided that that was the action you were going to take. And they've now been slapped in the face with that particular decision that they didn't expect. And so now their emotions are very, very high. And this is often the point where we're trying to negotiate with the other person or get it into mediation or do something along those lines. And very frequently that other person who has high emotion is like, I'm going to get an attorney. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And honestly, a lot of times it's a threat that is meant to sort of call your bluff and hopefully get you to change your mind if you're the person that's leaving. Okay. But more importantly, I think the mistake that's made is that the person that is leaving that made the announcement will say to the other person, look, I'd really like us to go to mediation or try to do this ourselves or just work together and try to get this resolved. And then the other person says something like, well, I'll go to mediation, but only if I get 100% custody, right? Or I'll go to mediation, but only if you agree to give me $10,000 a month. And then the person that's making the announcement goes, that's crazy. Why would I do that? You're not going to get all of the money. You're not going to get all of the kids. You're not going to why would I agree to that? I'm not agreeing to that. Or sometimes that'll happen with therapy, right? As people will say, well, I'll go to therapy, but only if you agree to this thing. And what I would tell you is don't try to negotiate that thing. What they're saying in that moment is, I'm worried. Okay, I'm worried, whether it's I'm worried about custody, I'm worried about financial survival, I'm worried about whatever. You don't want to say, well, that's ridiculous. You're not going to get that. Or I'm not going to agree to that before we go into a therapist or whatever. You want to acknowledge them and say, look, I get it. I know you're really worried about money. Or I get it. I know you've been the primary caregiver of the kids and that's really important for you. Or, I get it. That retirement you worked so hard for is really important for you to be able to preserve. Acknowledging that feeling does not mean I'm agreeing with it. Doesn't mean I'm saying, okay, you can have 100% of the kids. Okay, you can have all the support, or I don't pay any support, or A or B get all the retirement fund, whatever. It doesn't mean you're agreeing to any of that. It means you're acknowledging that person's fears and concerns about the issue. And then what happens is you can say, okay, I get it. I hear that that's a concern. And what I think we need to do is really get in front of the therapist, the mediator, the whoever you're trying to get the person to talk about this issue and see if we can come to some, solution on it. That's where I think we need to start. I know you're concerned. I'm concerned too. So how can we do this in a way that we can solve all of these problems for both of us, right? As opposed to going, well, that's ridiculous. You're never going to get that. I'm not agreeing to that. That's the number one way to cause yourself to not come to any resolution. And a lot of times I talk to people after the fact and I share that with them and they're like, oh, I wish I had done that. Okay, so I'm putting this out there early so that you can hopefully latch onto it and not make this error, because the beginning decisions are really some of the most critical decisions because they will often set the tone for the case. Okay, if you go into a domestic violence or a protective order of some kind, if you end up on supervised visitation, if you try to live with the person until conflict erupts and somebody's forced out, all of those things, that just sets you up for a ton of money, a ton of stress, a ton of grief. And so these early decisions are really, really critical. And honestly, these early decisions are a lot of times the point where people are not getting any sort of professional support from somebody who knows how to handle this or has been through it. A lot of times we're relying on friends, family, maybe people that it didn't go that well for and that weren't able to avoid the battle. Usually it's our friend that's going, oh, I've been through this 5 years of da, 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 da. And that's who you're taking your advice from. And if you think about it, it's like, okay, that's the worst person to take your advice from. Not that they may not have insight and experience, but really if they weren't able to avoid the very thing you're trying to avoid, and it looks different with each spouse and each situation, that advice maybe isn't as on point as some other help and support that you could get from somebody that really does know how to avoid that battle. So if you'd like to get this kind of support and learn more how you can keep your case on an amicable footing, deal with your narcissistic high conflict ex, and try to get through this with your sanity intact, you can go to divorceuniversityonline.com/VIP-coaching. There's information on that page on my group coaching programs, I should say. I have moms and dads, and information on my premium one-on-one VIP coaching services. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you guys next time.